in the year 1349, when the Genoese merchant Marco di Bella stood at the gates of Samarkand and looked east toward the mountains that led to Cathay, he knew he would be among the last Europeans to make this journey for generations, because the plague that had devastated the West had been born here, in these caravanserais and trading posts, and the ancient roads that had connected civilizations for thousands of years were now roads of death. Marco di Bella was 37 years old, born into a merchant family in Genoa that had traded across the Mediterranean and beyond for 3 generations. His grandfather had actually traveled part of the Silk Road in the early 1300s, when the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, had made these routes safer and more accessible than they'd been in centuries. That golden age of transcontinental trade had brought extraordinary wealth to merchant families willing to brave the distances and dangers, and Marco's family had been among them. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. But that was before the Great Mortality, before the plague that Italians called the Morte Nera, the Black Death, had swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing perhaps a third of the population. Marco had lost his wife and 2 children to the plague in Genoa in 1348, had watched helplessly as they died in agony, their bodies covered in the dark swellings that gave the disease its name. He'd survived, though he didn't entirely understand why, and in the aftermath he'd felt hollowed out, incapable of resuming normal life. So when his family's trading house had needed someone to travel east to settle accounts with partners in Central Asia, and to assess whether the overland trade routes were still viable after the plague, Marco had volunteered. It was partly duty. The family business needed attention after years of disruption, but it was also escape. He couldn't bear to remain in Genoa, where every street held memories of his dead family, where the city itself was still recovering from the catastrophe. He'd departed in early 1349, traveling first by ship to Constantinople, then overland through Anatolia and Persia, moving through landscapes that bore the marks of the plague just as Europe did. Empty villages, abandoned farms, cities with populations decimated. The plague had traveled these roads before him, had spread along the trade networks, and everywhere Marco went, he found evidence of its passage. Now, in late autumn of 1349, he stood at Samarkand, the great trading city of the Silk Road, the crossroads where east met west. Samarkand had been a legendary city for centuries, rebuilt by Timur, who Europeans called Tamerlane, into a jewel of Islamic architecture and culture. It was a city of blue-tiled mosques and bustling bazaars, of merchants speaking a dozen languages, of goods from China and India and Arabia and Europe all meeting in its markets. Or it had been. The city Marco found was changed, diminished. The bazaars were only half occupied with empty stalls where thriving businesses had once operated. The population was clearly reduced, though by how much was difficult to tell, and there was a wariness in people's faces, a hesitation about strangers, a fear that hadn't been there in his grandfather's descriptions of the city. Marco had taken rooms at a caravanserai, a traditional inn for traveling merchants, where traders could find lodging and warehousing for goods and information about road conditions and opportunities. The caravanserai keeper was a Persian named Hassan, a man perhaps in his 50s who'd been managing this establishment for 20 years and who'd seen the trade routes through their golden age and their collapse. Hassan brought Marco tea and sweets, the traditional hospitality, and they sat in the courtyard discussing business. Marco explained his mission: to settle accounts with his family's trading partners, to assess the viability of continuing trade along these routes, and, if possible, to travel as far east as circumstances allowed to understand what had happened to the great transcontinental trade that had once flourished. Hassan listened carefully, sipping his tea, his expression grave. When Marco finished, Hassan was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "The roads are broken," Hassan said finally. "Not physically. The roads themselves are still there, but the system that made them work, the network of merchants and caravanserais, and safe passage agreements, that's been shattered. The plague came from the east, you understand. It traveled the trade routes westward, killing as it went, and then trade stopped, because no one wanted to risk bringing the death with them. I know, Marco said. The same thing happened in Europe. Ships refused to dock in ports. Cities closed their gates to travelers. The trade that had connected the Mediterranean world stopped for 2 years. It's been longer here, Hassan said. 3 years, maybe 4 since the regular caravans stopped running. Some trade continues. There are always desperate or brave merchants willing to take risks, but nothing like before, and the political situation has deteriorated. The Mongol peace that made these routes safe, that's crumbling. The empire is fragmenting into competing khanates that are sometimes at war with each other. Without strong, unified control, the roads are becoming dangerous again. Marco had heard versions of this story at every stop on his journey, but hearing it from Hassan, who'd witnessed the trade routes in their prime, was particularly sobering. Is there any possibility of reaching Cathay? He asked. Any caravans heading that far east? Hassan considered. There's a caravan assembling now, planning to leave within the week. They're going to Kashgar, at the western edge of the Taklamakan Desert. From there, some may continue toward Cathay, though I don't know how far they'll be able to go. The roads through the desert are the most dangerous now. Bandits, water sources that have failed, caravanserais that have been abandoned. Could I join this caravan? If you can pay your way and if you're willing to accept the risks. But I must be honest with you. Marco di Bella of Genoa. Many who've attempted this journey in recent years haven't returned. I don't know if they died, or if they settled somewhere along the route, or if they simply found it impossible to come back. But they haven't returned. Marco thought about this. The sensible thing would be to settle his accounts in Samarkand, gather what information he could, and return to Genoa with a report that the overland routes were no longer viable. That would be the prudent, rational decision. But Marco didn't feel particularly sensible or rational. He'd already traveled thousands of miles from home, through landscapes devastated by plague and social upheaval. He'd survived dangers and discomforts, had been fundamentally changed by what he'd seen. And the idea of going further, of pushing into the territories that had been legendary in his childhood, held an appeal that went beyond business calculation. I'd like to join the caravan, Marco said. If they'll have me. Hassan nodded slowly. I'll introduce you to the caravan leader. But prepare yourself, Marco di Bella. What you'll see on these roads, it may be harder than anything you've seen in the West. The plague came from here, remember? It was born in these lands and its effects here have been profound. The caravan that Marco joined consisted of about 30 merchants and their servants, along with perhaps 60 pack animals, camels, horses, and sturdy ponies bred for mountain travel. The merchants were a diverse group. Persians and Arabs, Central Asians, from the various Turkish peoples, a few Chinese or Mongols heading east after trading in the western reaches, and one other European, an Armenian merchant named Jakob, who'd been based in Tabriz but who was now like Marco trying to assess the state of eastern trade. The caravan leader was a man called Rashid, a Central Asian merchant who'd been leading caravans along the Silk Road for 25 years. He was perhaps 50 years old, weathered by decades of sun and wind and desert travel, speaking half a dozen languages with varying degrees of fluency. He'd survived the plague by luck and by being in isolated desert areas when it had swept through the populated regions, and he decided to continue trading despite the changed circumstances because, as he told Marco, "This is what I know, this is what I am." They departed Samarkand on a clear morning in October, the autumn air already carrying hints of the winter to come. The road led east toward the mountains, following routes that had been used for thousands of years, that had carried silk and spices and ideas and religions across the breadth of Asia. The first week was relatively easy travel, through cultivated lands that were still being farmed, though clearly with reduced populations. Villages that should have been bustling were quiet. Fields that should have been intensively managed showed signs of abandonment. It was similar to what Marco had seen in Europe and in the western portions of his journey, the universal signature of the plague's passage. But the landscape was beautiful, despite the signs of decay. The autumn light was golden, the distant mountains snow-capped and majestic, the sky vast and clear in a way that it never was in Europe's more humid climates. Marco found himself affected by the beauty, by the sense of traveling through ancient lands, following routes that merchants had walked for millennia. He spent time talking with Jacob, the Armenian merchant, who'd had experiences similar to Marco's own. Jacob had lost family to the plague, had seen his trading network collapse, had decided that continuing to move forward was better than remaining stationary with grief. "I keep thinking about the stories we heard as children," Jacob said as they walked beside their pack animals one afternoon. "About the Silk Road, about the exotic goods from Cathay, about the adventures merchants had. Those stories made it all seem romantic, exciting. No one mentioned the plague, the death, the collapse of everything. Those things hadn't happened yet when the stories were being told," Marco pointed out. "The golden age of the Silk Road was real, from what my grandfather said. The Mongol peace really did make these routes safer and easier than they'd been in centuries. It's just that it didn't last. Nothing lasts," Jacob said philosophically. "I'm beginning to understand that. We build systems, networks, connections, and we think they're permanent. Then something like the plague comes along and shatters everything, and we realize how fragile it all was." They walked in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of the caravan around them, the bells on the pack animals, the conversations in multiple languages, the rhythmic crunch of feet and hooves on the ancient road. As they traveled further east, entering mountain territories, the landscape became more dramatic and the signs of disruption more evident. They passed a major caravanserai that had been burned, its stone walls blackened, its courtyard empty. Rashid explained that it had been attacked by bandits about a year previously. The merchants killed or driven off, the building itself destroyed. "This would never have happened before," Rashid said grimly. "The Mongol authorities would have tracked down anyone who attacked a caravanserai and punished them severely. The roads were protected. Now, with the empire fragmenting, with local authorities overwhelmed by the plague and its aftermath, the bandits are bolder. They increased their vigilance after that, posting guards at night, traveling in tight formation during the day, ready to defend themselves if necessary." Marco, who'd done some military service in his youth as was common for Italian merchants, found himself assigned to watch duty, spending cold nights peering into darkness and hoping that the bandits would find easier targets. The road climbed into the mountains, following passes that had been used since ancient times. The air grew thinner and colder, and Marco found himself struggling with the altitude, developing headaches and shortness of breath. The locals called this mountain sickness, and they treated it with tea made from local herbs, which helped somewhat. At one high pass, they found evidence of a caravan that had been caught by an early snowstorm. There were bones, human and animal, scattered along the road, partially buried by subsequent snows and uncovered by summer melting. Some of the human skulls showed marks of violence, suggesting that after the storm had trapped them, the merchants had fought among themselves, perhaps over the limited food or shelter. It was a grim reminder of the dangers they faced, and that night the mood around the campfire was somber. Rashid told stories of successful crossings, of times when caravans had made it through against odds, trying to maintain morale, but everyone could feel the weight of the abandoned caravanserai behind them and the bones in the pass ahead, physical evidence of how dangerous these routes had become. They descended from the high mountains into a region of wide valleys and scattered settlements. Here, the population seemed even more reduced than in the regions they'd passed through earlier. Entire villages stood empty, their mud brick buildings slowly eroding back into the landscape. Irrigation systems that had supported agriculture for centuries were broken and unmaintained, and the cultivated land was reverting to desert. At one settlement that was still inhabited, they stayed for 2 days, while Rashid negotiated for supplies and information. Marco wandered through the village, observing the people and trying to understand what had happened here. An old man, seeing Marco's interest and recognizing him as a foreigner by his clothing and appearance, approached and spoke in heavily accented but comprehensible Persian. "You're from the west?" "From Genoa, in Italy," Marco confirmed. "The plague came from here," the old man said. "You know that? It started in these lands, traveled west along the roads your people used to come here. We gave you death, and you brought it back to your own lands." Marco nodded. I've heard different theories about where it started. Some say it came from Cathay, others say it began in the steppe lands to the north. But yes, I know it traveled west along the trade routes. It killed half of us, the old man continued. Maybe more. We were already weakened by wars, by droughts, by Timur's campaigns. Then the plague came, and it finished what the other disasters had started. Look around you. This village had 300 people before the plague. Now we're 40. The young have gone, seeking better situations in the cities or in less affected regions. The old remain because we have nowhere else to go. I'm sorry, Marco said inadequately. It's the same everywhere, the old man asked. In the West? In your lands? Yes. We lost perhaps a third of our population in Europe. Some cities lost more. The social order was shattered. We're still trying to understand what it means. How to rebuild. The old man nodded. The world has changed. The Silk Road, which connected us, which brought wealth and goods and ideas, it also brought death. Maybe it won't recover. Maybe this is the end of the great exchange between East and West. Marco thought about this conversation over the following days as the caravan continued east. The Silk Road wasn't just a physical route, but a connection. A system that had linked civilizations for thousands of years. Silk had indeed traveled this route from China to the Mediterranean world. But so had Buddhism, Islamic learning, technological innovations, artistic styles, diseases, and countless other tangible and intangible goods. If this system was truly broken, if the plague had made it too dangerous or too feared to maintain these connections, then the consequences would be profound. The medieval world had been more interconnected than most people realized, with goods and ideas flowing across vast distances. If those flows stopped, if regions became more isolated, how would that reshape civilizations? They reached Kashgar in late November, having been on the road for more than a month. Kashgar was an oasis city on the western edge of the Taklamakan Desert, a crucial stopping point on the Silk Road where the northern and southern routes around the desert converged. It had been a center of trade for centuries, a cosmopolitan city where Chinese, Central Asian, Persian, and Indian merchants all met. The Kashgar that Marco found was functioning but clearly diminished. The Great Bazaar was perhaps half occupied, though it was still impressive by any standard. Covered arcades filled with goods from across Asia. Merchants calling out in multiple languages, the smell of spices and tea and animals and humanity all mixed together. Marco established himself at a caravanserai and spent several days meeting with local merchants, trying to gather information about conditions further east. What he learned was discouraging. The Mongol authorities in this region had been weakened by internal conflicts and by the plague. The desert routes to the east were more dangerous than they'd been in decades. Banditry was rampant, water sources were uncertain, and several caravanserais along the route had been abandoned or destroyed. Most significantly, communication with Cathay itself, the Chinese lands that were the ultimate eastern terminus of the Silk Road, had become extremely limited. There were reports that the Mongol Yuan dynasty that had ruled China had been overthrown or was in the process of being overthrown by native Chinese rebels. If true, this meant that the political unity that had facilitated trade was collapsing, that the routes into China might be closed to foreign merchants. Marco wrestled with what to do. He'd come this far, had traveled for months, had survived dangers and hardships. The sensible thing would be to declare that he'd reached the practical limit of travel, to turn back while he could still make it to Samarkand before winter made the mountain passes impassable. But a caravan was forming that planned to attempt the desert crossing, heading for Dunhuang, the famous oasis city at the eastern end of the desert that served as the gateway to China proper. It would be a dangerous journey, several weeks of desert travel with uncertain conditions. But if Marco could reach Dunhuang, he would be further east than almost any European had been in recent years, and he might be able to gather information that would be valuable for his family's business and for understanding what was happening to transcontinental trade. Jacob, the Armenian merchant, had decided to remain in Kashgar, concluding that the risks of going further outweighed any potential benefits. "I've been thinking about the old man in that village," Jacob told Marco, "about his question of whether this is the end of the Silk Road. I think maybe it is, at least for our generation. The connections are too broken, the risks too high. the profit margins too uncertain. I'm going to try to establish myself here in Kashgar. Maybe build a new trading network based on more regional connections rather than the transcontinental trade. It was a reasonable decision, and Marco considered following Jacob's example. But something in him wanted to see the desert, to test himself against a landscape that had been legendary in his grandfather's stories. And he wanted to reach the edge of Cathay, to see for himself what had become of the great Eastern civilization that had been the ultimate source of the silk and the porcelain and the exotic goods that had enriched his family. So Marco joined the desert caravan, a smaller group than the one that had brought him from Samarkand. Only about 15 merchants and their servants, with 30 animals. The caravan leader was a Uyghur named Timur, who'd been crossing this desert for 30 years and who claimed to know every water source and every danger. They departed Kashgar in early December, knowing that winter desert travel was risky, but hoping that the cold would be preferable to the extreme heat of summer crossing. The Taklamakan Desert was infamous, one of the most inhospitable deserts in the world, so arid that its name was often translated as the place of no return, or go in and you won't come out. The first days of desert travel were disorienting for Marco. The landscape was emptier than anything he'd experienced. Vast expanses of sand and gravel broken occasionally by rocky outcrops or dried riverbeds. The sky was immense, and the silence was profound when the wind wasn't blowing and the caravan stopped moving. They followed an ancient route marked by cairns and by the subtle signs that Timur could read in the landscape. The way sand had drifted, the presence of certain plants that indicated underground water, the angle of certain rock formations. They traveled in the relative cool of early morning and late afternoon, resting during the midday hours when even winter sun could be harsh in the desert's reflected heat. The nights were bitterly cold, with temperatures dropping below freezing. Marco slept wrapped in all the blankets and furs he possessed. Huddled close to the small fires they built using dry dung and the sparse desert vegetation. The stars in the desert night were overwhelming, more numerous and brighter than he'd ever seen. The Milky Way a river of light arching across the sky. On the 5th day they reached a caravanserai that should have been a major stopping point on the desert route. It was abandoned, its wells dry or poisoned, its buildings partially destroyed by some combination of neglect and deliberate vandalism. Timur was clearly troubled by this. He'd been counting on being able to replenish water supplies here. They moved on, now rationing water more carefully, and over the next week they found 2 more caravanserais in similar condition. The network of way stations that had made desert crossing possible was breaking down, and the implications were serious. Without reliable water sources at expected intervals, the desert crossing became much more dangerous, perhaps impossible. Timur called a meeting to discuss whether to turn back. They'd come perhaps halfway across the desert, and they still had enough water to return to Kashgar if they did so immediately. But if they pressed forward and found more dry wells, they might not have enough water to reach either Dunhuang ahead or Kashgar behind. The merchants debated. Some argued for turning back, not wanting to risk death by thirst in the desert. Others pointed out that they'd invested time and resources into this crossing, and turning back would make all of that wasted. Marco listened but didn't strongly advocate for either position. He'd come this far following impulses he didn't entirely understand, and he felt oddly fatalistic about the outcome. In the end, Timur decided they would continue forward, but with modifications to the planned route, heading toward water sources that were less commonly used and hopefully more likely to still be viable. This would add days to the journey, but Timur believed it gave them the best chance of success. The next week was the most difficult traveling Marco had ever experienced. They were on water rations that left everyone constantly thirsty, traveling through increasingly barren landscape, navigating by landmarks that weren't always clear. Some of the merchants began to show signs of despair, muttering that they'd made a fatal mistake, that they were going to die in this wasteland. Then, on what Marco estimated was the 15th day since leaving Kashgar, they saw something that made everyone stop and stare. A line of green on the horizon, trees and vegetation that marked an oasis. Timur confirmed that this was the water source he'd been aiming for, a spring-fed oasis that supported a small permanent settlement. The relief was overwhelming. They reached the oasis by late afternoon, and the sight of abundant water, of trees and grass after the barren desert, was almost overwhelming. They were welcomed by the oasis residents, a small community of perhaps 20 people who lived by the spring and by cultivating small gardens, surviving in the middle of the desert. They rested at the oasis for 3 days, replenishing water supplies, caring for the animals, recovering physically and mentally from the stress of the crossing. Marco spent time talking with the oasis residents through translators, learning about their isolated life. One woman, speaking through a merchant who understood her dialect, explained that they'd been less affected by the plague than the outside world because of their isolation. "The disease travels with people," she said. "We rarely have visitors, and when we do, we are careful about contact. The great sickness passed us by. It was a reminder that isolation could be protective, that the very connections that had made the Silk Road economically valuable had also made it a vector for disease. These desert communities, cut off from the broader world, had been spared the worst of the plague's effects. From the oasis, it was another week of travel to Dunhuang, following a somewhat more hospitable route with more regular water sources. The landscape gradually changed, becoming less purely desert and more a mix of desert and dry steppe, with more vegetation and occasional signs of habitation. They reached Dunhuang in late December, having been traveling for nearly 3 months since leaving Samarkand. Dunhuang was a revelation, a city that had been a crucial stop on the Silk Road for more than 1,000 years, home to the famous Mogao caves filled with Buddhist art and manuscripts, a true crossroads of civilizations. But Dunhuang, like everywhere else Marco had been, bore the marks of disruption. The population was reduced, many buildings stood empty, and there was a sense of uncertainty about the future. The Buddhist monasteries that had been centers of learning and art were struggling with reduced support and reduced numbers of monks. Marco established himself at a caravanserai and began the process of gathering information. What he learned confirmed the reports he'd heard in Kashgar. The Mongol Yuan dynasty in China was collapsing, being overthrown by Chinese rebel forces. The region was in chaos, with various factions fighting for control. Trade with the Chinese interior had been disrupted, and it was unclear when or whether it would resume. More importantly for Marco's immediate situation, the route back west was becoming more dangerous as winter deepened. The mountain passes he'd crossed coming east would soon be impassable, blocked by snow that wouldn't melt until spring. If he wanted to return to the west, he would need to winter in Dunhuang or somewhere along the desert route and attempt the return journey in spring. Marco considered his options. He could winter in Dunhuang, using the time to learn more about the region and its trade possibilities. Or he could attempt to travel further into China, though this was complicated by the political chaos and by the fact that the Mongol authorities who'd previously facilitated foreign merchants' travel were losing power. He consulted with local merchants, with the caravanserai keeper, with anyone who might have information. The consensus was that further travel into China was extremely risky right now, that he would be entering a war zone with uncertain loyalties and no clear protection. So Marco decided to winter in Dunhuang, to use the months of forced pause to gather information and to prepare for the return journey in spring. It was not the triumphal penetration into Cathay that he'd perhaps imagined, but it was a reasonable decision given the circumstances. The winter months in Dunhuang were surprisingly pleasant. The city was high and dry, and while the winter was cold, it was nothing like the bitter cold of the high mountain passes. Marco found lodging in a monastery, where the monks were willing to house foreign visitors in exchange for contributions to the monastery's support. He spent his time learning about the region, studying Chinese language and customs with monks who spoke Persian or Mongol, documenting everything he saw for his eventual report to his family. He visited the Mogao caves, marveling at the Buddhist artwork that covered the walls of hundreds of cave temples carved into the cliffs. The paintings were extraordinary. Scenes from Buddhist scriptures, portraits of donors, decorative patterns that showed influences from across Asia. The monks explained that these caves had been created over many centuries, that they represented the accumulation of artistic and spiritual work by generations of Buddhist practitioners. But they also said that the tradition was declining, that fewer new caves were being carved, that the support system that had maintained the site was breaking down. Marco couldn't help but see this as a metaphor for the Silk Road itself, a tradition that had flourished for centuries, but which was now declining, perhaps ending, as the systems that had supported it broke down. He had long conversations with other merchants who were also wintering in Dunhuang, sharing information about conditions in different regions. The picture that emerged was of a world in transition, of old orders collapsing and new ones not yet established, of routes that had connected civilizations for millennia now becoming dangerous or impassable. One Chinese merchant, speaking through a translator, told Marco, "The Mongol Empire brought us a period of connection, of relative safety for travelers and traders. It wasn't perfect. The Mongols were conquerors and could be brutal, but they did establish systems that allowed trade to flourish. Now those systems are collapsing, and I don't know what will replace them. Perhaps China will close itself off again, limiting contact with the outside world as it has done in previous eras. Perhaps new empires will arise that facilitate trade. Perhaps the Silk Road as we've known it is finished." Marco thought about this constantly during the winter months. He'd traveled thousands of miles, had risked death multiple times, had seen landscapes and peoples that few Europeans had encountered, and the overwhelming impression he'd gained was of disruption, of systems breaking down, of connections being severed. The plague had been the catalyst, but it wasn't the only factor. Political fragmentation, climatic changes that were making some regions less hospitable, shifts in economic patterns, all of these were contributing to the transformation of the Silk Road from a functioning transcontinental trade network into something more fragmented and uncertain. Spring came to Dunhuang in March 1350, and Marco began preparing for the return journey. He joined a caravan that was heading west, a somewhat larger group than the one that had brought him east, including several Chinese merchants who were trying to reach Persian markets despite the dangers. The return journey was, if anything, more difficult than the eastward trip had been. They found that conditions in the desert had deteriorated further. More caravanserais abandoned, more water sources questionable, more signs of banditry and violence. They were attacked once by a group of raiders, a brief, terrifying encounter that resulted in 2 members of the caravan being killed and several animals stolen before the raiders withdrew. But they made it through the desert, crossing back into the mountains as summer was beginning. The high passes were clear of snow, and they moved through the dramatic landscape Marco had seen the previous autumn, now green with spring growth rather than brown with winter dormancy. They reached Kashgar in early summer, and Marco spent several weeks there, settling business affairs and recovering from the desert crossing. He found Jacob still there, having established a small trading operation focused on regional goods rather than transcontinental trade. Jacob reported that conditions in the west had not improved. The mountain passes were being controlled by competing warlords. Banditry was endemic. The political situation was chaotic. Marco and Jacob discussed what they'd learned, trying to piece together a comprehensive understanding of the state of the Silk Road. The picture was bleak. The transcontinental trade that had flourished in the early 14th century had collapsed. The plague had been the immediate cause, but the political fragmentation of the Mongol Empire and the rise of more localized powers had made recovery difficult. "I think your Chinese merchant friend was right," Jacob said. "This is the end of an era. There will still be trade, still be connections between regions, but the great caravans traveling from the Mediterranean to Cathay, those are finished for now. Maybe for generations." Marco nodded slowly. "So my journey, all of this, it was essentially documenting the end of something, rather than participating in its continuation." "Perhaps," Jacob agreed, "but that's still valuable. To witness an ending, to understand what's being lost, that matters." Marco continued west in late summer, joining a caravan heading back towards Samarkand. The journey retraced his steps, moving through the now familiar landscapes, seeing how conditions had changed or worsened since he'd passed through the previous year. They reached Samarkand in early autumn, and Marco found Hassan, the caravanserai keeper he'd met more than a year earlier, still operating his establishment, though clearly struggling with reduced business. Hassan was pleased to see Marco return alive, saying that he'd given up hope that anyone from that desert caravan would make it back. "You made it to Dunhuang?" Hassan asked over the traditional tea and sweets. Yes, and I spent the winter there. I saw what I came to see, learned what I came to learn. And what did you learn? Marco thought about how to summarize the thousands of miles, the months of travel, the countless conversations and observations. I learned that the world is changing more profoundly than I realized. The Silk Road that my grandfather traveled, that system is gone. Something else will eventually emerge, but it will be different, more regional, more fragmented. The age of easy transcontinental travel, if it ever really existed, is over for now. Hassan nodded. I've come to the same conclusion. I'm too old to adapt to new systems, but perhaps the next generation will find different ways to connect east and west, or perhaps they won't, and the regions will become more isolated for a time. Marco continued west, moving through Persia and Anatolia, seeing more evidence of plague devastation and social disruption. By the time he reached Constantinople in late 1350, he'd been traveling for nearly 2 years, had journeyed further east than most Europeans of his generation would ever go, had witnessed the collapse of a system that had connected civilizations for more than 1,000 years. From Constantinople, he took ship back to Genoa, arriving in early 1351. Nearly 2 years after he'd left, the city was still recovering from the plague, still marked by population loss and economic disruption. But it was home, and Marco felt an unexpected surge of emotion as the city came into view from the ship. His family received him with genuine relief, having given up hope that he'd return. He'd been gone longer than anyone expected, and they'd heard nothing from him for more than a year. They gathered to hear his report, eager to understand what he'd learned and whether there were opportunities for resuming Eastern trade. Marco told them everything: the devastated cities, the dangerous routes, the collapsed caravanserais, the political fragmentation, the end of the Mongol peace. He described the desert crossing, the winter in Dunhuang, the return journey through increasingly dangerous territories, and he gave them his conclusion. Transcontinental trade along the Silk Road was no longer viable, at least not for the foreseeable future. His family accepted this report with resignation rather than surprise. In his absence, they'd been developing alternative trading networks, focusing more on Mediterranean routes, on connections with North Africa and the Islamic world, on opportunities closer to home. Marco's journey had confirmed what they'd suspected. The Silk Road era was over. But Marco's family did something unusual with his report. They had it written down, not just as a business document, but as a narrative, a detailed account of his journey and observations. This document was circulated among merchant families and eventually found its way to scholars and writers interested in geography and exploration. Marco himself never traveled again. He remained in Genoa, helping manage the family business, eventually remarrying and having more children. But he never forgot the landscapes he'd seen, the people he'd met, the sense of witnessing the end of an era. He would sometimes tell stories of his journey to his children, describing the vastness of the desert, the beauty of the mountains, the exotic cities of Central Asia, the Buddhist caves filled with ancient art. His children would listen with the same wonder that Marco had felt as a child, listening to his grandfather stories of the Silk Road. But Marco always ended these stories with a caution. "The world I saw is gone now," he would say. "The roots are broken, the connections severed. Perhaps someday they'll be restored. Perhaps future generations will rebuild what was lost. But for now, the Silk Road exists only in memory and in the goods that remain from its golden age, the silk and porcelain and spices that we still treasure but can no longer easily obtain." The document that Marco's family had commissioned, recording his journey, survived through various copies and eventually became a valuable historical source. Historians would later use it to understand the state of the Silk Road in the mid-14th century, to see how the plague had affected these trade routes, to document the end of the medieval period of transcontinental exchange. Because Marco di Bella had been right about one thing: the Silk Road that his grandfather had known, the transcontinental trade network that had flourished in the early 14th century under Mongol protection, did not recover after the plague. Trade continued on a more limited regional basis, but the great caravans traveling from the Mediterranean to China essentially ceased for more than a century. It wasn't until the late 15th and early 16th centuries, when European explorers began searching for sea routes to Asia, that transcontinental connections would be re-established on a large scale. The age of exploration, with its sea voyages around Africa and across the Pacific, would create new forms of connection between civilizations, replacing the overland Silk Road with maritime routes. But that was in the future. In the mid-14th century, when Marco returned from his journey, the world was in a period of contraction, of reduced connections, of regions becoming more isolated. The plague had not just killed millions of people. It had severed the networks that had linked civilizations, had made the world, in a sense, larger and more divided. Marco would sometimes stand on the docks in Genoa, watching ships come and go, carrying goods around the Mediterranean. He would think about the goods that weren't arriving, the silk and porcelain and Eastern spices that had once been readily available, but which were now rare and precious. And he would think about the landscapes he'd seen, the empty caravanserais and abandoned villages, the desert wastes and mountain passes that fewer and fewer people were crossing. The Silk Road had been more than a trade route. It had been a symbol of connection, a physical manifestation of the ways civilizations could interact despite vast distances. Its decline was a reminder of fragility, of how quickly systems that seem permanent can collapse, of how vulnerable human connections are to disruption. In his later years, when Marco was an old man, he would occasionally meet travelers who claimed to have been to the east, to have crossed the desert or reached Samarkand. He would question them carefully, comparing their stories to his own memories, trying to understand whether conditions had improved or continued to decline. Most reports suggested continued decline. The desert routes were even more dangerous, the caravanserais even more ruined, the political situation even more chaotic. A few merchants still made the journey, driven by the exceptional profits that could be made on the rare goods that came from the east. But they were taking extraordinary risks, and many didn't return. Marco felt fortunate to have made his journey when he did, to have seen the Silk Road in its last years of marginal viability, before it became truly impossible. He'd witnessed an ending, had documented a historical transition, and while it hadn't been the profitable trading mission his family had hoped for, it had been valuable in its own way. On a spring morning in 1382, when Marco was 70 years old, he climbed a hill outside Genoa and looked east toward the mountains that marked the beginning of the long route to Asia. He couldn't see very far. The Mediterranean landscape of Italy was too hilly, too forested, too densely settled to offer the vast vistas he remembered from Central Asian steppes and deserts. But he could imagine the route stretching eastward, could picture in his mind the landscapes he'd traveled through more than 30 years earlier. The oasis cities, the mountain passes, the endless desert wastes, the Buddhist caves, all existing still but increasingly isolated, increasingly disconnected from the broader world. He thought about Hassan, the caravanserai keeper in Samarkand, and wondered if he still lived, if his establishment still operated. He thought about Temur, the desert guide who'd led them across the Taklamakan, and wondered if he'd survived more crossings, or if the desert had eventually claimed him. He thought about Hakob, the Armenian merchant who'd stayed in Kashgar, and wondered what had become of his attempt to build a regional trading network. All those people, all those lives, all those connections, they'd been real, had mattered, had been part of a vast network of human interaction that the plague had helped destroy. The Silk Road had been built over millennia by countless individuals making countless journeys, and it had been broken in just a few years by disease and political collapse. But Marco knew that something of what had been would persist. The goods that had traveled the route, the silk and spices and ideas and art, those had permanently changed the civilizations they'd reached. The connections might be broken now, but they'd existed and they'd mattered, and perhaps someday they would be rebuilt. He turned and walked back down the hill toward Genoa, toward the life he'd built after his journey, toward the family and business and community that grounded him in place. The Silk Road was closed, but life continued as it always did, adapting to new circumstances, finding new paths forward. Marco di Bella died in 1386, At the age of 74, having lived long enough to see his grandchildren grown and his family's trading business adapted to the new Mediterranean-focused reality, he was buried in Genoa, far from the landscapes he'd traveled through in his youth, far from the desert sands and mountain passes that had tested him. But his account of his journey survived, preserved through copies, eventually finding its way into archives and libraries where historians would discover it centuries later. Through his words, future generations would understand what the Silk Road had been in its final years, what it meant to travel those routes after the storm of plague had broken the systems that had sustained them. The story of Marco di Bella's journey is one of countless similar stories from the mid-14th century, stories of travelers who witnessed the end of an era, who documented the collapse of connections, who saw firsthand how fragile the networks that bind civilizations can be. Most of those stories were lost, unrecorded, forgotten, but enough survived to give us glimpses of that transitional moment, that period when the medieval world order was breaking down and something new, what we call the early modern period, was beginning to emerge. The Silk Road after the storm was a road of endings and of memories, of empty caravanserais and overgrown paths, of connections severed and opportunities lost. But it was also a reminder that what humans build, humans can rebuild, that roots can be reopened, that civilizations can reconnect. The particular Silk Road that Marco walked was dying, but the impulse to connect, to trade, to travel, to build bridges across distances, that impulse was enduring, and it would eventually find new expression in new forms. As Marco had said to his children, the roads are broken now, but they've been broken before and been restored. Perhaps it won't happen in my lifetime, perhaps not in yours, but someday, people will again travel freely between East and West, will again trade across the breadth of Asia, will again connect the civilizations that the Silk Road once linked. The routes may change, the methods may differ, but the connection will return, because that's what humans do. We build connections, we cross distances, we refuse to let mountains and deserts and political borders completely separate us. We are a connecting species, and though specific connections may break, the impulse to connect never dies. Standing on his hilltop outside Genoa in 1382, Marco di Bella had believed that, had hoped for it, had trusted that the ending he'd witnessed wasn't final but transitional. And though he wouldn't live to see it, he was right. The connections would return, the routes would be rebuilt, the civilizations would reconnect. Not in the same form, not along the same paths, but the fundamental pattern of connection would persist as it always had, as it always would for as long as humans existed to build bridges across the distances that separated them.